October 25, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea. The sky bleeds pink and gold across the horizon, but Commander Ernest E. Evans barely notices. He stands on the bridge of USS Johnston, coffee cooling in his hand, eyes locked on the radar screen. The green glow flickers. Contacts, big ones, moving fast from the north. His radar officer's voice cracks. "Sir, multiple surface contacts, bearing 340, range 30,000 yards. Evans leans closer. The blips are massive, too massive. Behind him, the 6 escort carriers of Taffy 3 churn slowly through calm waters, their decks crowded with aircraft. Little more than cargo ships with flight decks, thin-skinned and vulnerable. They were never meant to face warships. The radio crackles. Lookouts confirm visual contact. Pagoda masts. The unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese battleships. Evans sets down his cup. His hand doesn't shake. Around him, the bridge falls silent except for the hum of instruments and the distant rumble of the sea. He knows what's coming. They all do. The most powerful battleship force in the Pacific is bearing down on them, and there's nowhere to run. By October 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached its critical turning point. For 3 years, American forces had clawed their way across thousands of miles of ocean, island by island, atoll by atoll, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the Marianas, each name written in blood and sacrifice. Now General Douglas MacArthur was finally ready to fulfill his promise, to return to the Philippines. The invasion of Leyte Gulf was more than a military operation. It was a symbolic reclamation, a declaration that Japan's empire was collapsing. On October 20th, 1944, American forces stormed ashore on Leyte Island. The landings went smoothly. Troops advanced inland. MacArthur waited ashore for the cameras, his famous words echoing across the posse. "Thick. I have returned." But the Japanese had no intention of surrendering the Philippines without a fight. Imperial General Headquarters understood the stakes. Lose the Philippines, and Japan would be cut off from its southern resource zones, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the rice of Indochina. The empire would starve, the war would be lost. So they devised Shogo, Victory Operation. It was a plan born of desperation, brilliant and reckless in equal measure. The Japanese Navy would gather every remaining capital ship, every battleship and cruiser that could still sail, and throw them at the American invasion fleet. 4 separate forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, catching the Americans in a devastating pincer. Admiral Takeo Kurita would command Center Force, the heart of the assault. Under his flag sailed the greatest concentration of surface firepower Japan could muster. Battleships Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest warships ever built, each displacing 70,000 tons, armed with 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of small cars over 25 miles. Battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. It was a fleet designed to annihilate anything in its path. The plan required perfect coordination. Southern Force would enter Leyte Gulf from the south through Surigao Strait. Northern Force, built around Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, would act as bait, drawing away Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. With Halsey gone, Center Force would slip through San Bernardino Strait undetected and fall upon the vulnerable invasion transports and escort carriers supporting the landings. On paper, it could work. In execution, it demanded flawless timing, perfect communication, and a level of luck Japan no longer possessed. Center Force departed Brunei on October 22nd, steaming northeast through the Palawan Passage. American submarines spotted them immediately. USS Darter and USS Dace shadowed the formation, then struck. Torpedoes slammed into 3 heavy cruisers. 2 sank outright, including Kurita's flagship, Atago. The admiral was pulled from the water, shaken but alive, and transferred his flag to Yamato. The next day, October 24th, American carrier aircraft found Center Force in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes swarmed the Japanese ships. The super battleship Musashi, pride of the Imperial Navy, absorbed an apocalyptic beating, 19 torpedo hits, 17 bomb strikes. She rolled over and sank, taking half her crew with her. Kurita turned his battered force around, retreating westward. American pilots reported him fleeing. Halsey, monitoring the battle from his flagship, concluded Center Force was finished as a threat. Then came the fatal decision. Reports reached Halsey that Japanese carriers had been spotted far to the north. Northern Force, under Admiral Ozawa, was sailing south with 4 carriers. To Halsey, carriers were the ultimate prize. He'd spent the war hunting them. Here was a chance to destroy Japan's remaining flat tops in one decisive blow. He took the bait. Halsey turned north with every battleship, every cruiser, every carrier of Third Fleet. He left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. No one was watching the back door. And Kurita, after dark on October 24th, turned his ships around again. Through the night, Center Force crept through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Lookouts on the Japanese ships scanned the darkness for American pickets. There were none. Kurita could hardly believe his luck. The strait was wide open. By 0300 hours on October 25th, his entire force had passed through and was steaming south along the coast of Samar Island, heading straight for the American invasion fleet. Waiting off Samar were 3 small task units, codenamed Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. These were not fleet carriers, they were escort carriers, slow, ungainly vessels built on merchant ship hulls, designed to provide air support for ground troops and anti-submarine patrols. The Navy called them CVEs. The men who served on them had their own nickname: combustible, vulnerable, expendable. Each escort carrier displaced about 10,000 tons, carried 28 aircraft, and had a top speed of 17 knots. Their hulls were thin steel, barely enough to stop machine gun fire, let alone armor-piercing shells. They had a single 5-inch gun for self-defense, more symbolic than effective. Taffy 3, the northernmost group, consisted of 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitcun Bay, and Gambier Bay. Screening them were 3 destroyers: Hoel, Heermann, and Johnston, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts. Against Kurita's battleships and cruisers, they stood no chance whatsoever. The math was brutal. Yamato alone outweighed the entire American formation. Her 18.1-inch guns could fire shells 5 times heavier than anything the Americans possessed. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick, invulnerable to destroyer guns. The heavy cruisers carried 8-inch rifles, the light cruisers 6-inch. Even the Japanese destroyers matched or outgunned their American counterparts. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Taffy 3 from the carrier, Fanshawe Bay. A cautious, methodical officer, he'd spent the night worried about air attacks. Japanese land-based aircraft from Luzon had been harassing the escort carriers for days. He kept combat air patrols aloft, watching the sky. No one was watching the sea to the north. At 0637 hours, lookouts on Fanshawe Bay spotted anti-aircraft fire on the horizon. Sprague assumed it was American ships, firing at Japanese planes. Then the shells began falling closer. Enormous geysers of water, tinted pink and green and yellow by dye markers, erupted around the carriers. A signalman on Fanshawe Bay saw the forest of masts on the northern horizon and counted them in disbelief. He turned to an officer. "My God, that's the whole Jap fleet." Sprague's blood turned to ice. He grabbed the radio and broadcast an unencrypted plea for help. Enemy surface force attacking. Composition: 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, destroyers. Our position. There was no one close enough to help. Halsey was 300 miles north chasing Ozawa's carriers. The battleships that should have been guarding San Bernardino Strait were gone. The nearest American heavy ships were hours away. Taffy 3 was alone. 3 was. Sprague ordered his carriers to launch every aircraft they had, armed or not. Planes roared off the decks with whatever ordnance was available, some with torpedoes, others with bombs, many with nothing but machine gun ammunition. Pilots made dummy runs trying to distract the Japanese gunners, anything to buy time. He ordered smoke. The destroyers and destroyer escorts began laying chemical smoke screens, thick white clouds that clung to the water, obscuring the carriers. The wind cooperated, blowing the smoke back toward the enemy, and he ordered his carriers to run. 17 knots was painfully slow, but it was all they had. The carriers turned south and opened their throttles, black smoke pouring from their stacks. Kurita's ships closed at 25 knots. The range dropped steadily. 18 miles. 15. 12. The Japanese gunners found their rhythm. Shells from Yamato's main battery arched through the sky and crashed into the sea near White Plains, each impact throwing up geysers taller than the carrier's mast. An 8-inch shell from cruiser Tone smashed into Gambier Bay, tearing through her thin hull, killing men instantly. The carriers were dying, and the destroyers knew what they had to do. Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on Johnston's bridge, watching the tracers arc overhead, feeling his ship shudder as near misses shook the hull. The fire control radar tracked the Japanese formation, battleships, heavy cruisers, all of them closing. Behind him, the carriers were trying to escape, helpless, fragile, full of sailors and pilots and mechanics who'd never asked to face battleships. Evans made his decision. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't call Admiral Sprague for permission. He turned to his crew and spoke over the intercom, his voice calm and certain. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. He paused. Prepare to attack. Ernest Edwin Evans was not the typical Naval Academy graduate. Born in Oklahoma in 1908, he was part Cherokee, a heritage he wore with quiet pride in an officer corps that was overwhelmingly white and Eastern. His path to Annapolis was unconventional. He'd worked his way through college before receiving his appointment. He graduated in 1931 in the depths of the Depression when commissions were scarce and the Navy was cutting budgets. But Evans was determined. He served on battleships, cruisers, destroyers. He learned gunnery, navigation, tactics. He studied the great naval battles of history, Trafalgar, Jutland, Tsushima, and absorbed their lessons. He understood that in naval combat, hesitation was death. Those who served under him described a man of contradictions. He could be warm and fatherly, joking with enlisted men, remembering their names and hometowns. Then, in an instant, he'd become cold and demanding, drilling his crew until their responses were automatic, until they could load and fire the guns blindfolded. He believed in aggression. When Johnston was commissioned in October 1943, Evans gathered the crew and told them bluntly what kind of ship they would be. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. No one got off. Over the following year, Johnston built a reputation. At Kwajalein, she provided fire support for the Marines, hammering Japanese bunkers until her gun barrels glowed. At Saipan, she screened the carriers, splashing Japanese torpedo bombers. She fought through kamikazes, submarines, air raids. Evans drove his crew hard, but he also protected them fiercely. When supplies ran short, he scrounged and traded and called in favors to make sure his men had what they needed. When they went into port, he made sure they got liberty. When they fought, he led from the front. His executive officer once said of him, "The captain was a fighter. He'd fight anything that floated and a lot of things that didn't." Now at dawn on October 25, 1944, he had his fight. USS Johnston for DD 557 was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of 175 identical ships that formed the backbone of the U.S. Navy's destroyer force in World War II. She was 376 feet long, displaced 1,200 tons, and could make 38 knots when her boilers were pushed to the limit. Her hull was narrow and graceful, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than armor. Her plating was thin, barely half an inch of steel in most places, just enough to keep the ocean out and provide structure. Her armament was formidable for her size. 5.5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in single mounts, 2 forward, 2 aft, 1 amidships. These guns could fire 22 rounds per minute, throwing 55-pound shells out to 9 miles. They were effective against aircraft, surface targets, and shore installations. But her real punch came from her torpedoes. 10 21-inch Mark 15 torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts, mounted amidships. Each torpedo carried 825 pounds of TNT and could travel 6,000 yards at 46 knots. They were designed to crack open battleships, to punch through armor belts and flood compartments. A single torpedo hit could cripple a heavy cruiser. 2 or 3 could sink one. The problem was range. To launch torpedoes effectively, a destroyer had to close to within 10,000 yards, 5 miles, of the target. Against ships armed with 14-inch and 16-inch guns that could hit at 20 miles, getting that close was suicidal. Johnston's crew numbered 327 men. Most were young, early 20s, some still teenagers. They came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, fishermen from Massachusetts. The Navy had trained them in their specialties, gunners, torpedomen, engineers, radio men. But nothing could truly prepare them for what they were about to face. They trusted their captain. Evans had drilled them relentlessly. They knew their jobs. They knew their ship. and they knew, without being told, that when Evans gave the order to attack, they would follow. On paper, the engagement was not a battle. It was an execution. The Japanese center force mounted firepower that dwarfed Taffy 3's entire defensive screen. Yamato alone carried 9 18.1-inch guns, each capable of hurling a 3,200-pound shell, heavier than a small car, over 25 miles with devastating accuracy. Her secondary armament included 12 6.1-inch guns and 12 5-inch guns. Her armor belt was 16 inches thick at its strongest point, tapering to 8 inches at the extremities. American 5-inch shells would bounce off her like pebbles. The heavy cruisers, Haguro, Tona, Chikuma, Kumano, each carried 10 8-inch guns with a range of 18 miles. They were fast, capable of 35 knots, and their shells could penetrate destroyer hulls at any range. Against this, the American destroyers brought 5-inch guns and torpedoes. Their guns, while rapid-firing and accurate, couldn't penetrate battleship armor. Their torpedoes were deadly, if they could get close enough to launch them. But closing the range meant steaming directly into the teeth of enemy fire, through a storm of shells that could obliterate a destroyer with a single hit. The tactical doctrine was clear. Destroyers were not meant to engage battleships in daylight surface action. Their role was to screen the fleet, hunt submarines, provide anti-aircraft defense, and launch torpedo attacks under cover of darkness or smoke. A daylight charge against a superior force was considered suicide, but tactical doctrine assumed you had options. Taffy 3 had no options. If the destroyers didn't attack, the carriers would die. Every minute the destroyers could delay the Japanese, every ship they could damage or distract bought time for the carriers to escape, for their aircraft to strike, for help to arrive. Evans understood this calculus perfectly. So did every other destroyer captain in the screen. The question wasn't whether to attack, it was who would go first. Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on Yamato's flag bridge, watching the American ships scatter through his binoculars. This was the moment he'd sailed for. After days of air attacks, after losing Musashi, after threading San Bernardino Strait in darkness, his force had finally caught the Americans by surprise. The enemy carriers were running, laying smoke, but they were slow. His battleships would catch them within the hour. Then the reports started coming in. Destroyers charging, retreating, not screening, charging directly at his formation. Kurita frowned. It made no sense. Destroyers attacking battleships in broad daylight was suicide, unless they weren't escort carriers ahead. Unless this was a trap. Unless those were fleet carriers with a powerful screen, and heavier ships were waiting just over the horizon. He'd been ambushed twice already. Submarines in Palawan Passage, aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea. American intelligence seemed to know his every move. His nerves were frayed, his staff exhausted. The American destroyer came on, bow pointed like a spear, smoke pouring from her stacks. Gun flashes rippled along her deck. Splashes erupted near Kumano as shells found the range. Kurita's flagship began maneuvering to avoid potential torpedo tracks. Other ships followed suit. The neat battle formation began to dissolve. On board the heavy cruiser, Kumano commander Soichiro Ishikawa watched the American destroyer through the rangefinder. He'd fought in the Solomons at Midway in a dozen forgotten skirmishes. He knew courage when he saw it. Range to target, 12,000 meters, closing. All guns, target the destroyer, fire when ready. Kumano's turrets trained on Johnston. The 8-inch guns roared, spitting flame and thunder. Seconds later, shells screamed through the air. Ishikawa expected the destroyer to turn away, to launch torpedoes and flee behind smoke. That was doctrine. That was sanity. The destroyer kept coming. Aboard Johnston, the crew reached that strange calm that comes when fear transforms into purpose. In the forward engine room, Chief Machinist's mate Robert Billy watched his gauges climb into the red. The captain had called for flank speed, then beyond flank speed. The turbines screamed, the deck plates vibrated, and steam pressure climbed to levels the manufacturer never intended. Billy ignored the warnings. If the engines exploded, it wouldn't matter. If they didn't give everything now, the carriers would burn. He cracked the throttles wider. In Turret 51, the forward 5-inch mount, gunners mate first class. Fred Sachs loaded shells with mechanical precision. His crew had practiced this drill 1,000 times. Load, ram, fire, load, ram, fire. The gun barrel was already hot, the recoil mechanism cycling so fast the breech barely closed before the next round was chambered. A Japanese shell screamed overhead so close they felt the pressure wave. No one flinched. There was no point. They were inside the enemy's range now. Either the armor-piercing shells would hit them or they wouldn't. All they could do was keep shooting. On the bridge, Evans conned the ship with icy precision. He'd studied the Japanese formation during the approach, identified the cruisers as the most dangerous targets. The battleships were terrifying, but they were slow to maneuver. The cruisers were fast and deadly. Come left to 270, prepare to launch torpedoes, target the lead seat. Cruiser. The talker repeated the orders. Below decks, torpedomen trained the quintuple mounts, checking the gyros, setting the run depth and speed. These were Mark 15 torpedoes, older models, reliable but unforgiving. If the settings were wrong, they'd run deep or surface or circle back. Ensign Robert Hagen, the torpedo officer, rechecked the firing solution. Range, 10,000 yards. Target bearing, steady. Speed, 30 knots. He fed the data into the torpedo director. Evans waited. The range counter clicked down. 9,000 yards, 8,000. Japanese shells were falling like rain now, geysers of water rising on all sides, drenching the deck with spray. 7,000 yards. Fire torpedoes. The mounts hissed. Compressed air ejected the torpedoes from their tubes. They hit the water, stabilized, and accelerated to 46 knots, trailing white wakes across the blue water. 10 torpedoes racing toward the Japanese cruiser line. Evans didn't wait to see the results. Hard right rudder. Make smoke. Johnston heeled into a tight turn, her stern generators belching thick chemical smoke. The white cloud spread across the water, swallowing the destroyer. The smoke saved them, not immediately but gradually, degrading Japanese fire control and spreading confusion. Modern naval gunnery in 1944 was a science. Optical rangefinders measured the distance to target. Fire control computers calculated elevation, bearing, and lead based on target speed and course. Shells were fired in salvos, the splashes observed, corrections radioed, and the next salvo adjusted. But the system required clear visibility. It required tracking the target continuously. Lose sight of the enemy for even a few seconds, and the firing solution degraded. The target could turn, accelerate, slow down. The next salvo would miss. Taffy 3's destroyers and destroyer escorts pumped out smoke with desperate intensity. Chemical generators on their sterns produced thick white clouds that clung to the water, spreading laterally in the wind. The destroyers wove through their own smoke, darting out to fire salvos, then disappearing again. From the Japanese ships, the tactical picture disintegrated. One moment they were firing at a clearly visible destroyer. The next it vanished into white fog. Radar could still track the targets, but Japanese surface search radar in 1944 was primitive, its accuracy measured in hundreds of yards. It couldn't provide the precision needed for accurate gunnery. Spotter planes could have helped, flying above the smoke to dire CT fire. But Kurita had launched few float planes, and those that were aloft were being harassed by American fighters from the escort carriers. The result was chaos. Japanese ships fired into the smoke, hoping for lucky hits. Shells landed randomly. Some fell close enough to damage American vessels with splinter and concussion. Others exploded harmlessly in the open sea. A few, tragically, hit other Japanese ships as the formation maneuvered frantically. Radio discipline collapsed. Captains shouted contradictory reports. Kurita's staff struggled to maintain a clear picture of the battle. How many enemy ships were there? Where were the fleet carriers that must be lurking beyond the smoke? Where were the American battleships? The Americans were equally confused, but it didn't matter. They had one mission: delay the enemy. Confusion helped them. Every minute the Japanese spent maneuvering, firing blindly, hesitating, was a minute the carriers gained. And Johnston, somewhere in that smoke, was still fighting. At 0720 hours, observers on Kumano saw white wakes streaking toward them through the smoke. Torpedoes, multiple tracks. Close. The cruiser's captain screamed orders. The helm went hard over. Kumano heeled sharply, her screws biting the water, trying to turn inside the torpedo's arc. Other cruisers saw the danger and maneuvered frantically. One torpedo passed down Kumano's port side, missing by meters. Another ran hot and true. The explosion tore through the cruiser's bow. A column of water and flame erupted from the forward hull. The blast crumpled 30 feet of plating, flooded 2 compartments, and killed a dozen men instantly. Kumano shuddered, lost speed, and began listing. She was out of the fight. Other torpedoes scattered the Japanese formation. Suzuya turned hard to avoid a spread, putting her beam to the American carriers and losing ground. Tone maneuvered violently, disrupting her fire control solution. The neat battle line dissolved into a chaotic melee, and Johnston emerged from the smoke, still shooting. Evans had turned back toward the enemy. He could have run, hidden in the smoke, tried to escape. Instead, he saw the confusion his torpedoes had caused and pressed the attack. Johnston's 5-inch guns fired continuously. The crews were exhausted, their hands bleeding from handling the hot shell casings, but they didn't slow. Turret 51 hit Kumano twice more, shells smashing into her superstructure. Turret 52 engaged a destroyer, driving it back with a flurry of accurate fire. But Johnston was running out of luck. A Japanese heavy cruiser, likely Congo, though the identification was never certain, found the range. Her first salvo straddled Johnston's shells, exploding on both sides simultaneously. The second salvo hit. 3 14-inch shells struck almost simultaneously. The first hit the bridge, penetrating the thin plating and exploding inside. The blast was catastrophic. Fire and shrapnel tore through the cramped space. Men died instantly, vaporized, shredded, burned. The navigation equipment shattered. The radio went dead. Evans was standing near the chart table when the shell hit. The explosion threw him across the bridge. Shrapnel tore through his left hand, mangling 2 fingers. Blood poured from a dozen other wounds. Around him, half his bridge crew lay dead or dying. He pulled himself upright, ignored the pain, and assessed the damage. The bridge was wrecked, but the ship was still moving. He shouted down to the backup conning station, "Steer from aft. Continue the attack." The second shell hit amidships, smashing into the aft engine room. The explosion ruptured steam lines, and superheated steam at 600 degrees filled the compartment in seconds. Men died screaming. The engineering crew that survived stumbled out through watertight doors, their skin scalded, their uniforms melted to their flesh. One engine was gone. Johnston's speed dropped from 35 knots to 17. The third shell hit aft, near the steering gear. It didn't penetrate completely, but the concussion buckled plating and jammed one of the rudders. Johnston began to list to port, but she was still fighting. Turret 51, somehow untouched, continued to fire. The crew didn't know if anyone was still alive on the bridge. They didn't know if the ship was sinking. They just kept loading and shooting because that's what they'd been trained to do. Evans, bleeding heavily, wrapped a rag around his mangled hand and climbed down from the ruined bridge. He made his way aft to the steering compartment where a damage control team was manually operating the rudder. He took command from there, shouting orders through a sound-powered phone. Johnston limped back into the smoke, trailing oil and listing heavily. Her speed was crippled. Her bridge was destroyed, her engines were dying, but she had bought 20 minutes for the carriers. It wasn't enough. The Japanese were still coming. At Oro 7:40 hours, Admiral Sprague ordered the other destroyers to attack. Commander Amos Hathaway on Heermann and Commander Leon Kintberger on Hoel didn't hesitate. They'd watched Johnston's suicidal charge, seen her disappear into the smoke, heard the explosions. They knew what was coming. Both destroyers accelerated to flank speed and charged the Japanese battle line. Hoel targeted Congo, the closest battleship. Her captain intended to get close enough to launch torpedoes, then pray the ship survived long enough to escape. At 15,000 yards, Japanese shells began falling around her. At 12,000 yards, a 16-inch shell from Congo struck Hoel's bridge, killing the captain's talker and wounding several others. Kintberger stayed on his feet. Continue closing. All guns. Engage the battleship. Hoel's 5-inch guns barked defiance, their shells sparking harmlessly off Congo's armor. But the psychological effect was real. Battleship captains didn't like destroyers closing at high speed. Torpedoes were dangerous. One lucky hit could cripple even a battleship. Congo and Haruna shifted fire to Hoel. Shells rained down. At 10,000 yards, Hoel launched her torpedoes. All 10 spread across the battleship line. Then she turned to escape. She didn't make it far. Multiple shells hit her in rapid succession. A 14-inch shell penetrated her forward engine room. Another destroyed Turret 51. A third hit aft, jamming the rudder hard over. Hoel began steaming in circles, unable to steer, her speed dropping. The Japanese closed in. More shells hit. Fires broke out across the ship. The captain ordered abandon ship at 08:30 hours. 15 minutes later, Hoel rolled over and sank, taking 89 men with her. Herman fared better, but only barely. She charged through the Japanese formation, weaving between battleships and cruisers, firing at point-blank range. At one point, she passed so close to Haruna that the battleship's guns couldn't depress far enough to hit her. She launched her torpedoes at 3,000 yards, suicidally close, and scored possible hits on both Haruna and Nagato. Then she ran, laying smoke, dodging shells, her hull peppered with splinter damage but still afloat. The destroyer escorts, tiny ships, half the size of fleet destroyers, armed with only 3 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes, joined the charge. Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond screamed into the battle, their young crews firing with desperate courage. Samuel B. Roberts engaged the heavy cruiser Chikuma, trading shots at close range. For 20 minutes, the little destroyer escort fought like a battleship, her guns firing so fast the barrels overheated and cracked. Then Japanese shells found her. Hits ripped through her thin hull. She lost power, lost steering, and began to sink. Her crew abandoned ship, and she went down at 09:10 hours, but the charge worked. At 08:20 hours, USS Johnston was dying, but she refused to quit. She'd been hit more than 40 times. Her speed was down to 8 knots. Her engines were barely functioning. Her hull was riddled with holes, seawater flooding 3 compartments. Half her crew was dead or wounded. She had no torpedoes left, and only 3 of her 5 guns were still operational. But Commander Evans was still alive, still commanding from the aft steering compartment, and Johnston still had ammunition. Evans saw a formation of Japanese destroyers moving to flank the carriers. Small, fast, and deadly, they were trying to get into torpedo range of the escort carriers. If they succeeded, Taffy 3 would be annihilated. Evans didn't think, he reacted. Come right, all remaining guns target those destroyers, fire for effect. Johnston turned one last time toward the enemy. Turret 51, Turret 52, and the amidships mount opened fire. The range was close, 6,000 yards, then 5,000. The 5-inch shells, finally facing targets they could hurt, tore into the Japanese destroyers. One destroyer, likely Nowaki, took multiple hits. Shells smashed into her bridge and forward gun mount. She turned away, her formation disrupted. The other Japanese destroyers, seeing the American destroyer still fighting despite her obvious damage, hesitated. Their captains had been told they faced escort carriers with minimal defense. This ship, smoking, listing, barely moving, was still shooting at them with frightening accuracy. They turned away to reassess. It was Johnston's last contribution. At 0850 hours, a Japanese cruiser, some survivors believed it was Haguro, found her again. 3 8-inch shells hit in rapid succession. One penetrated the forward magazine. There was no dramatic explosion. The magazine had been mostly emptied, but the hit caused catastrophic flooding. Just Johnston began to list heavily to port. Evans knew it was over. He ordered abandoned ship. The crew, though still alive and able to move, began throwing life rafts overboard and jumping into the warm Philippine Sea. Some were wounded, others burned, all exhausted. They watched their ship from the water. Johnston rolled slowly onto her beam ends. Her stern lifted, screws still turning slowly. For a moment she hung suspended, bow down, then she slipped beneath the surface. It was 09:45 hours. She'd been fighting for 3 hours and 10 minutes. Commander Ernest E. Evans was last seen on the stern, refusing to leave his ship. Some survivors reported he gave them his life jacket. Others said he simply stayed aboard, too badly wounded to swim. When Johnston sank, he went with her. Of 327 crew members, 186 died. The survivors floated in the water for 2 days before being rescued, but the sacrifice had worked. At 09:11 hours, just minutes before Johnston sank, Admiral Kurita made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered center force to break off the attack and withdraw. His staff stared at him in disbelief. They were winning. The American carriers were fleeing. 2 destroyers and a destroyer escort had been sunk. The American formation was in disarray. 1 more hour, maybe less, and they'd be in gun range of the carriers themselves. But Kurita saw something else. He saw chaos. His formation was scattered, ships maneuvering independently to avoid torpedoes. He'd lost contact with half his force. Reports were flooding in. American torpedoes in the water, more destroyers attacking, aircraft swarming his ships. Kumano was crippled, Suzuya damaged by air attack, Chikuma burning. And the Americans kept fighting. Destroyers that should have fled hours ago were still shooting. Escort carriers that should have been sunk were still launching aircraft. Where were the fleet carriers? Where were the American battleships? His nerves, already frayed by days of combat, snapped. He convinced himself this was a trap, that heavier forces were waiting beyond the smoke, that he was about to be ambushed again. He turned his ships around and steamed back through San Bernardino Strait. Taffy 3 had been saved. The battle ended, but the dying continued. Survivors from Johnston, Hoel, and Samuel B. Roberts floated in the water, clinging to life rafts and debris. The Philippine Sea was warm, but sharks circled, drawn by blood. Some men had been burned, their skin hanging in strips. Others had broken bones, internal injuries, wounds that bled slowly into the salt water. They watched Japanese ships pass by. Some enemy vessels ignored them. Others slowed, and for a moment the Americans feared they'd be machine-gunned in the water. It had happened before in other battles. Instead, Japanese sailors threw down bottles of water and provisions. One Japanese destroyer captain was seen saluting the survivors as his ship passed. They floated for 2 days. On October 27th, American ships finally arrived to pull them from the water. Many had died by then, from wounds, exhaustion, exposure, or sharks. Some simply gave up and slipped beneath the surface. The rescued men were skeletal, sunburned, delirious. They were taken to hospital ships, given water and morphine, and slowly brought back from the edge. It took weeks before some could speak coherently about what they'd seen. The escort carrier Gambier Bay had sunk during the battle, hit repeatedly by Japanese cruiser fire. She was the only American carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war. 100 men went down with her. St. Lo survived the surface action, only to be struck by a kamikaze aircraft an hour later. The suicide plane crashed through her flight deck, its bomb detonating in the hangar bay. The explosion triggered fires that reached the torpedo magazine. St. Lo blew apart and sank in 30 minutes, killing 114 men. The other carriers of Taffy 3, Fanshawe Bay, Kalinan Bay, Kitkin Bay, White Plains survived, though all were damaged. They limped back to port for repairs, their crews haunted by how close they'd come to annihilation. The final butcher's bill was sobering. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Over 1,000 American sailors died, another 1,000 were wounded, but they'd won. The invasion transports in Leyte Gulf, packed with soldiers and supplies, were untouched. Not a single landing craft was sunk. The ground campaign continued without interruption. MacArthur's promise was kept, and Center Force, the most powerful battleship formation Japan could assemble, retreated without accomplishing its mission. It never reached the invasion beaches. It never sank the transports. It was harassed by air attacks on its withdrawal, losing more ships, and limped back to Brunei, a shattered force. Japan never again attempted a major surface action. The combined fleet was finished. The story of Taffy 3's stand spread quickly through the Pacific Fleet. When Admiral Nimitz read the reports, he could hardly believe what he was reading. Escort carriers and destroyers had fought off battleships. Ships that should have been obliterated in the first salvo had held the line for hours. Destroyers had charged battleships in broad daylight and survived. He immediately recommended medals. Commanders Evans, Kintberger, and Copeland, captain of Samuel B. Roberts, were put forward for the Medal of Honor. Evans' award was approved. On August 7, 1946, in a ceremony at the Pentagon, his widow received the Medal of Honor on his behalf. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, engaging the enemy in a sea of overwhelming firepower, Commander Evans inspired his men to fight with such ferocity that they drove back the enemy force, saving the carrier group from certain destruction." He was the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the Medal of Honor. A destroyer, USS Evans, at DE 1023, was later named in his honor. But the question haunted historians and naval officers for decades. Why did Kurita retreat? He had every advantage. His ships were faster, heavier, more powerful. The Americans were running out of ammunition, out of torpedoes, out of options. One more hour and he would have been among the carriers, sinking them at point-blank range. Post-war interviews with Kurita provided no satisfying answer. He cited fatigue, poor communications, fear of air attack, and concern about American submarines. He mentioned the ferocity of the destroyer attacks, the smoke, the confusion. But the real answer may be simpler. Kurita had been conditioned to expect American material superiority. For 3 years, Japanese commanders had been overwhelmed by American numbers. More carriers, more planes, more ships. When he encountered resistance at Samar, his instinct told him it must be the vanguard of a much larger force. He didn't realize he was fighting the entire force, that the destroyers charging his battleships were all the Americans had, that the escort carriers fleeing south were the only carriers in range. The Americans, by sheer audacity, had bluffed Japan's most powerful admiral into retreating from a battle he'd already won. Admiral Sprague, in his after-action report, was characteristically modest. The success of the escort carriers and their screen in driving off the Japanese force can be attributed to two factors: the determination of the destroyers and destroyer escorts to press home their attacks, and the skill and bravery of our pilots. But in private, he told a fellow officer, "I didn't think we'd last 20 minutes. If Evans and those destroyer captains hadn't charged when they did, we'd all be dead." The battle also revealed deep flaws in Japanese naval doctrine. Their ships were individually powerful, but their commanders had been trained for the decisive fleet engagement, the climactic battle where both sides committed everything in a single apocalyptic clash. They struggled to adapt when the battle became chaotic, when the enemy refused to fight according to doctrine. American commanders, by contrast, had learned to improvise. The Pacific War had been a grinding, brutal education in flexibility. When the plan collapsed, and it always collapsed, American officers made new plans, adapted, and fought with whatever they had. Taffy 3's stand became a case study at the Naval War College. For decades afterward, officers studied the battle to understand how inferior forces could prevail through aggression, coordination, and sheer courage. And they studied Commander Evans's decision to charge without orders, without hesitation, without hope of survival. It violated doctrine, it was tactically insane, and it saved an entire task group. Sometimes the lesson went, hey, doctrine has to be thrown overboard. Sometimes the only sane decision is to do the insane thing. There are moments in war when everything balances on the edge of a single decision. October 25, 1944, at dawn off Samar Island was one of those moments. A decision made in seconds, without time for calculation or staff conferences or consultations with higher command. A decision made by one man, standing on the bridge of a small destroyer, watching the horizon fill with enemy ships. Commander Ernest Evans could have waited for orders. He could have fallen back with the carriers, laid smoke, and hoped for rescue. No one would have blamed him. His ship was a destroyer, not a battleship. He'd done his duty simply by being there. Instead, he attacked. And in that choice, that mad, glorious, impossible choice, he saved thousands of lives. The Battle off Samar is not as famous as Midway or Guadalcanal. It doesn't have the symbolic weight of D-Day or Iwo Jima. But those who study naval warfare know its significance. It was the last great surface action of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's battleship navy was finally broken, not by American battleships, but by destroyer crews who refused to die quietly. Johnston rests now in 20,000 feet of water, her hull crushed by pressure, her guns silent. In 2019, a deep-sea expedition found her wreckage, still recognizable despite decades on the ocean floor. The images showed her broken bow, her collapsed superstructure, her gun turrets frozen at odd angles. But they also showed her bow pointed forward. Even in death, Johnston was still attacking. Commander Evans has no grave. His body went down with his ship somewhere in the dark water off the Philippines. But his name lives on memorial walls, in history books, in the memories of the families whose fathers and grandfathers came home because a Cherokee Navy officer from Oklahoma decided that some things are worth dying for. Taffy 3's survivors, those who lived through the battle and the long wait in the water, never forgot what they'd seen. They returned to civilian life, raised families, built careers, but every year on October 25th, they remembered. They gathered at reunions, fewer each year, and told stories of a morning when the world seemed to end and somehow didn't. They remembered the roar of guns, the smell of smoke, the taste of fear. They remembered friends who never came home, ships that never came back. They remembered a captain who led them into hell and made them believe they could win. And they remembered that courage is not the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act despite it, to sail into overwhelming fire because someone has to fight when survival is impossible because surrender is worse, to charge forward when every instinct screams to run because behind you are people who cannot defend themselves. That is the legacy of USS Johnston and Commander Ernest E. Evans. Not a legend, not a myth, just men on a ship who did what needed to be done. And it was enough. The most insane naval battle in history happened when a tiny destroyer charged straight at the largest battleship ever built. October 25, 1944, Commander Ernest Evans saw Japanese battleships bearing down on defenseless escort carriers off Samar Island. His destroyer USS Johnston was outgunned, outarmored, and outnumbered. Any rational officer would retreat. Instead, Evans ordered a full-speed torpedo run directly into the enemy fleet, a suicidal charge that military doctrine called impossible. For 3 brutal hours, Johnston and her sister ships fought the most powerful naval force Japan could assemble, buying time through sheer audacity and sacrifice. This is the true story of how one man's insane decision at the Battle of Leyte Gulf saved thousands of lives and changed the course of the Pacific War forever.